Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, American Oaks, Diversity, Ecology, and ID. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our programs to a broader audience. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. Our Focus on Sustainability partners are the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, Deep Roots Kansas City, Rescape California, the American Public Gardens Association, and the Ecological Landscape Alliance. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Tim Boland. Tim is the Executive Director of Polly Hill Arboretum on the island of Martha's Vineyard, just off Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Tim is a plantsman with varied interests, including oaks, magnolias, and the genus Stewartia. His work at the Arboretum includes developing a modern working flora for the Martha's Vineyard and the adjacent islands. Tim also travels widely to collect seed for the Arboretum's collections. Tim's work with oaks has been ongoing since 1995, when he traveled to Oaxaca, Mexico for his graduate studies at Michigan State University. Tim is also on the board of the International Oak Society, where he is chair of the Oak Research and Conservation Committee. Welcome, Tim.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Penny, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and thank you for the collaborators in sponsoring my talk. I'm very pleased to be here. First off, I'm glad you're here. I hope you're all healthy and safe. We'll get started, and I want to tell you a little bit about my oak life. It's really involved three different stages. One is a grower, as a nurseryman and propagator. One is kind of a plant taxonomist that studies plant diversity. And now my role here as an administrator, but also being involved with different groups trying to save oaks from extinction. And I can explain that a little bit during the talk. But they've all been very rewarding. When I was a grower, I was at Michigan State University, and I was growing trees for the campus arboretum. And I also had just joined a graduate program in botany. Not sure exactly what I wanted to do, but knowing I wanted to learn more about plants. And I was down in the herbarium at Michigan State looking at oak specimens, which an herbarium specimen is a flat, dried specimen with a label on it. And I was trying to discover in and around where oaks were so I could go and collect seed. And I used to make myself a pest down there frequently. And the herbarium curator, Dr. Jose Pinero, one day said to me, do you like oaks? And I said, well, yeah, yes, I do. I love oaks. And he said, well, I hate them. I was like, well, I've never heard that. Why? And he went into great detail about the torturous characters of some oak species, determine what is an oak and determining which oaks are distinct from each other. So through a further relationship with Dr. Pinero, he invited me to travel, and eventually I would get my master's degree on the Flora of Oaxaca, which is in the very southernmost part of Mexico. It's a very rich and biodiverse state. The Center for Oak Diversity is in Mexico. So as a guy growing up in Michigan and being transported to the montane forest of Oaxaca, it was quite a startling thing. But I would go on to work with oaks that way, and then later become involved with oaks through the International Oak Society, and now my role. So we're going to go through oaks in a couple of different ways. I'm not going to get into painstaking detail of identification because that's extraordinarily boring. So I'm going to hit on a lot of different subjects that I hope will keep you interested and involved. Let's look at oaks, though, from a big perspective. In the world, currently, they guesstimate, or should have a pretty good handle, that there are 430 species of oaks worldwide. We see in North America throughout their range, and then down into Mexico and into South America, but over into Europe, when oaks aren't actually species rich in Europe because of the geological past history, but there are oak forests there, certainly. And then as you go over into Asia, lots of diversity, and then also subtropical to tropical oaks going all the way over into Malaysia, Borneo, and down into those areas. Our focus, though, today, for the most part, is on temperate oaks. You'll see at the end of the talk, there's a resource page which has all the links, so you don't have to write any of this stuff down. And one is to the Flora of North America. And this is online, incredible illustrations of the species-rich plants in North America with these great illustrations. Dr. Kevin Nixon, who was the author of this originally, the original volume of Oaks, the Flora of North America, is at Cornell University and is somebody who helped me with my work on Mexican oaks. He's also an expert throughout Mexico. When we look at what we have here, though, in North America, north of Mexico, 91 species. There are 12 in New England, which we'll talk about. Mexico, though, is the center for diversity, but I should mention recent papers through DNA work and combined studies of many oak researchers have found that oak diversification of two groups, the two groups we'll talk about today, the white oak group and the red oak group, happened in North America. The record goes back 45 million years, but the most diversification happened with the rise of the intercontinental mountain ranges and the creation of new niche areas for them to kind of diversify. So North America plays an incredible role in terms of oak diversity. And that includes these trees eventually moving down into Mexico through the Ice Age and kind of speciating down there and becoming rich. We also have oaks in Asia, and some of those oaks we cultivate at Polly Hill. There's a reference that you can go to with incredible information and photographs of almost every oak called Oaks of the World. There are subzones, though, in the United States. California is rich in oaks, beautiful, beautiful oaks in California, and I've had the opportunity over a dozen times to go travel there. Southeastern North America has 26 species. Our work at Polly Hill is collecting some oaks for display at the Arboretum and to tell their stories. And we go down to Appalachia. We also go over to the Smoky Mountains and all the way down to the panhandle of Florida looking for oaks. Texas, everything's bigger in Texas. There's 50 species in Texas. Some of these go over into Mexico, but they're really fantastic there. Of course, these oaks survive, drought conditions, sometimes extreme alkalinity. If you ever get a chance to go to what's called the Edwards Plateau, that is an area of rich diversity. How do we separate them? Well, the groups we'll talk about today in terms of the nomenclature, not so much nomenclature, but the taxonomy. There's the white oaks, which is called section Quercus, and then the red or black oak group. So with white oaks, the leaves are lobed, and they can be toothed, but they are without bristle tips. So that's one of the key features that separates them right away. The acorns with the white oak group mature in the very first year. So from pollination and fertilization of the flower and then production of the acorn, that all happens in 1 year. All oak species have tannins in them, which are bitter chemicals. If you look at the roots, the bark, the stems, the twigs, and the acorns, they all have these bitter chemicals. However, the white oak group has less of them, so they're more or less immediately favored by animals to begin with in terms of using them as a food source. That includes human beings, which I'll talk about. But with that, you'll see that the red oak group is different. The inner surface of the acorn, the cap of the acorn, which we know is very distinctive, is called the cupule. If you look inside it, sometimes you'd need a hand lens, but if you look at the interior of it, it is smooth or lacks hairs, what we call glabrous. When we look at the other dividing group, that is the red or black oaks. It's called the section lobate. These leaves are lobed and they are toothed and they have bristly tips. So that is a breakdown that's fairly easy to follow. I'll give examples where it might not be. The acorns, though, take 18 months from fertilization to maturation to happen. So they kind of more or less become mature in their second year, and they are bitter, relatively bitter. So here on Martha's Vineyard, our canopy, I should say we have 6 oak species and 4 documented hybrids. The black oaks here, the acorns are still on the ground here. So it takes snow and rain, and right around usually the end of March, the animals will say, okay, now I can eat these. The inner surface of the acorn cup here is hairy and felty at times, and you can see that sometimes with the naked eye. I should point out, though, these features in these 2 taxonomic groups are important. They cannot hybridize between each other. So the white oak section Quercus can have hybrids only within its section. Then the red or black oak section can only hybridize within its section. So it is a reproductive barrier that has come through the evolution of these 2 separate groups. Here's a very simple leaf depiction of the white oak with the rounded lobes with no bristle tips, and then you see the bristle tips with the black oak. This is Quercus alba on the left, I think your left, and Quercus velutina on the right. They both have sinuses or indentations in this case, but bristle tips on the black oak group or red oak group. I'm going to talk about the flowers, which many of us walk by because they're, I don't want to say they're insignificant, but they're tiny, and they're in the leaf axils, so they appear on the same tree, or they're monoecious, but they're not encompassed in one flower. So they're monoecious, but male and female flowers appearing in different parts of the plant. So here is the female flower, and I'll show you this here. These stigmatic surfaces are very sticky to collect the pollen because oaks are wind pollinated. They're not insect pollinated, so they have really no need for nectars or intense vibrant colors to pull insects in, but it does matter to their ecology. So when we look at the male flower on the same tree, many of you know birch trees have a similar type flower called a catkin. It's a long, stringy inflorescence, and with individual male flowers on it with numerous stamens. And here on Martha's Vineyard, the oak flowers shed normally in and around mid-May, and it's such a shedding of pollen that actually people have written on my car windshield, "wash me," or on my trunk of my car, because there's such a downpour of pollen. It also happens to be at the same time nearly in a crossover with Pinus rigida, pitch pine here, so they both come at you. With a cruel twist of fate, with my own genetic failings, I am allergic to oak pollen, so I don't know why that's happened, but it is. Oaks grow in close company in forests because of their wind pollination, and also the distribution of acorns are generally in and around, not too far from the trees that drop them. But often, if you travel into various oak ecosystems in the North America, and down into Mexico, in Appalachia, and different parts, oftentimes they're growing side by side with pines. The development of the acorn is a very curious thing. Anatomists have struggled with trying to figure out exactly how the acorn formed and why it's this way through evolutionary history. As near as I can tell, and honestly, I need to do more research, the cupule, which is the cap, is a fusing of stems, apparently, over time. And what you see is the developing cupule or the acorn cap. Here in the middle, though, you'll see that with those 3 different stigmas, only 1 acorn is produced, and they think over time that there's been a reduction, perhaps saving energy, not to produce as many acorns, but to focus your energy on 1 acorn to be reproductively successful. I didn't mention this before, but the distinctive acorn cap, the cupule, in the white oak group, they're pretty tightly woven and oppressed is what they call them. With the black oak group, they're kind of scaly at the end, as if you could lift them up with your fingernail. But the mature acorn is a thing of beauty. For real plant nerds, raise your hands out there. Some of us collect them. When you look at the diversity of the acorns in the world, this is just a sampling from one of my favorite books, which is in your reference guide, called Oaks of California. They do have a reference section looking at the diversity of cupules throughout the genus Quercus. When you look at these magnificent and really cool morphologies of oaks from the Himalayas and Borneo, Malaysia, they're really, really striking. At the Polly Hill Arboretum, we have this one, the Turkish oak, Quercus cirrus, which is actually a very distinct section of oaks in Europe. And then variabilis here, we have this oak, which is from Asia. It's called the cork bark oak. But when you go into California, you'll see actually longitudinal acorns that are really curious. The golden cup oak, which I came across a few times, which is truly a magnificent acorn with incredible gold cupules. And then one we collected in the Ozarks called Ligrata, appropriately named the overcup oak. Sometimes these cupules completely surround the seed. So as we look at oaks and people who collect acorns, we say there's a problem out there. It's actually a long-term association with fauna, which we'll get into in a moment. But the acorn weevil, for a plant propagator, we think it might be evil because it lays its eggs into the body of the acorn, and they hatch and they feed on the cotyledons and render the acorn you can't germinate an acorn necessarily. Sometimes you can if they haven't eaten all of it. I've had some success, as long as they don't attack the plumule, which is going to become the stem ultimately. You can find some of these, but if you're collecting acorns, any oak person will tell you, take them off the tree as opposed to the ones lying on the ground. It's not 100% that you're not going to have them if you take them off the tree. It's just more likely that you'll find a whole acorn without a weevil off of the main tree. And also you may have less problems with fungus and mold. Let's look at oaks in New England, and I should mention this publication also includes oaks that are not native to New England, but I wouldn't say they're naturalized, but they do appear in herbarium collections. So on Martha's Vineyard, we have English oak, Quercus robur, which appears here. I wouldn't say it naturalizes. We have people who plant them and they produce acorns and they sprout in and around the tree. One here listed, Quercus imbricaria, is a simple leaf oak. It's a beautiful tree. It's mostly in the Midwest, but it does appear in some of the counties in Massachusetts as an escapee, I guess I'd call it. I haven't really heard of oaks becoming classically invasive in the sense that they more or less kind of alter ecosystems, but you know what? Maybe that will come with climate change. We just don't know. 12 native oaks. I mentioned the shingle oak, but here they are with the two different groups, and we'll look at them. One thing I love about teaching, and as I found out about Quercus muhlenbergii, which was one of the first oaks I grew from seed. It favors limestone, and limestone in and around where we are is incredibly rare. There is limestone in western Massachusetts and other parts of Massachusetts. So Quercus muhlenbergii is an endangered oak in terms of as it occurs in only a few counties in New England. Let's look at the oaks, so just small portraits of them. We'll go through these quite quickly. The longest species living oak or live oak is Quercus alba. And when the colonists came over into Plymouth and they visited Martha's Vineyard actually in 1602, they found the white oak, and they were already using their own white oak, Quercus robur, for shipbuilding and in wine and beer barrels. So white oak has a lot of different uses, but it's got a classic look to it. It's got these scaly patches, lighter bark, rounded lobes, lighter color to the twigs. For the most part, they're glabrous or not hairy, and a distinctive acorn. This publication I want to alert you to, it's completely free and downloadable. It's great. It's from the United States Forest Service, sponsored with the USDA, and it's a field guide to the oaks of northeastern North America. And when you look at this, it contains the Flora of North America illustrations, but it goes into the range of oaks throughout North America. So you can see white oak actually has an extensive range all the way into Texas, the Panhandle, but also things about the acorns, our favorite food source for birds, squirrels, and deer. Other little tidbits that you'll like. You'll notice here it says the circumference of the largest oak, 32 feet, grew in White Oak State Park in Maryland. I'd been to that tree. It since has shattered and fallen apart. They do get big, though. I had kind of an interesting trip that I was asked to kind of co-lead with an oak person who's forgotten more than I know about oaks, and that's Guy Sternberg, who has his own arboretum, Star Hill Forest in Illinois. Well, we led a group of international dendrologists to the Ozarks and southern Illinois in particular, and then down into Missouri, where we found some huge big trees. Here's a huge Quercus alba. And as we go down, this is a tree actually I just threw in here I'd forgotten about, from Michigan, in Hazlet, Michigan, a 300-year-old white oak at a friend's house. When they leaf out, they can look like this. I should mention, when they do leaf out, they're flowering, and here are the catkins that haven't fully opened to shed their pollen. But it happens generally at the same time all at once, and it can be quite a beautiful stage. The fall color of white oak is notable. It can be kind of this burnished kind of maroon color or orangey red, turning that way. They're really fantastic trees. Here is a huge tree at the Carpenter Nature Reserve on our trip in 2004. So they can grow wide or big like those trees I showed you, and tall in a forest like you see it here. This is what they do on Martha's Vineyard. White oak, I should say, Quercus alba, isn't salt tolerant. So here, they're pretty brutalized by two things, three actually. Pretty crappy soils that are extremely acidic, 4.8, 4.5 pH. Strong winds. The other day with the nor'easter, we had about 45-mile-an-hour winds. That's not unusual here with hurricanes. So plants don't grow tall, they grow wide. They grow up, and you can see the tops of trees twisted here, but they do form these magnificent forms, which are quite impressive to see and really inspirational. Here's a tree, sorry it's not a great photo, that's only about 15 feet tall and about 30 feet wide in Chilmark, Massachusetts. This is a white oak, believe it or not, close to the ocean. On our trip with the dendrological group in the Midwest, we did come across a few of these trees, which are Native American trail markers. The Native Americans used to mark their trails by tying stones or weight onto the ends of trees and bending them over to create these trail markers. And we saw 2 or 3 of these on our journey. You know, most of these trees, though, of course, are failing because people don't do that anymore. So we don't have as many left. An oak that has a lot of promise for urban use is swamp white oak in the white oak group, Quercus bicolor. And Quercus bicolor has this kind of netted bark. It's darker than white oak, and it has these twigs that have kind of a little bit of scaling. The interesting thing about the cupule here is it has a long stalk, which makes it easy to identify and compare to white oak. The other oak that has that that's not native is a series of what's called the pedunculate oaks, which would be Quercus robur. It has the same type of long stem. The leaves are obovate and they're bicolored. If you look at the top of the leaf, it's really curious. It's kind of waxy. And the bottom of the leaf is whitish with tomentose hairs. The curious thing about this tree is it actually, because it's from swamps, it's actually easy to transplant. It has a taproot, but it has more fibrous roots. Here is a magnificent planting at the Scott Arboretum, a Swarthmore Collis. These trees put in the ground in the late 1800s, some of them replanted. It's really quite a thing to see. I should point out with white oaks and also red or black oaks, but white oaks and black oaks in particular, do you see this kind of patchwork? This is called smooth patch, which is a native fungus that gets on our oak trees. It's not debilitating or damaging, but it will eat away that scaly bark and create these patches. And you can see they're very distinct. People here on Martha's Vineyard point them out to me and think the trees are sick, but it's just one of the many ways that oaks host different types of organisms. And this one is a mutualism where one doesn't, wipe out the other. Swamp white oak, though, can have this beautiful kind of conical form. You can see the leaves, very shiny. But here it is at the Morton Arboretum growing in a swamp. So these trees, and another tree we'll look at today, the pin oak, when they grow in flat bottomlands or wetlands, they often can or show adaptability to urban conditions, so make really great street trees, if not for the species itself, by using them, by grafting onto them as a source. So they take anaerobic conditions, and that's what they have in urban conditions. The curious thing about bicolor, Quercus bicolor, which I learned by getting this together, the county distribution is very interesting. You can see it on the right by Angelo and Buford and in most every county, but it's not in our county, Dukes County. So this is yet another example. We're working on the Flora of Martha's Vineyard where there's a distinct dividing line between the Cape Cod, the geology that rolled out. So Quercus bicolor is native to the Mid-Cape or Outer Cape, and it's also native to Nantucket. So we have a similar situation with the swamp cypress, Chamaecyparis thyoides, being here near the Marconi Point on the Cape, native to Nantucket, not native to Martha's Vineyard. A really curious dividing line, one that's funny. The plants down here in Falmouth and Barnstable County, we're Dukes County. One of our spring ephemerals, skunk cabbage, is only native to Martha's Vineyard and this lower part of the Cape, and I'm afraid that Nantucket doesn't have that. They must be upset by that, I'm sure. But here is the Bur Oak, which is another tree which I would call has a lot of adaptability. This one actually to both moist and dry conditions. The Bur Oak, the acorn is the telltale sign of this. It gets that name. Has similar twigs to Quercus bicolor, and this is probably the closest one you might confuse them with, but it does not have the long stalk of the acorn. The leaf is divided. This is often a sign too of a plant that is drought tolerant. When you have the leaf surface kind of divided up, it has a way of kind of offing the heat and being drought tolerant. Very, very tough tree. Here's some monster trees from our trip in 2004. Very extensive boughs, much like white oak. And that's in Illinois. And here it is up close, just limbs going right to the ground. And the other aspect that you can find on older trees primarily is this kind of corky twigs, which are a little bit like liquidambar, the sweet gum. A tree that I really admire, and I have 5 groups of them in my yard here on Martha's Vineyard. I have about 3/4 of an acre, is the post oak, and that's Quercus stellata. It has stellate hairs on the undersurface of the leaf. It has an extensive range. It has been used for fence posts and many other things, but in and around New England, you can see it kind of extends itself here. It goes into New York, into the Champlain Valley, but it is on both the Outer Cape and I believe on Nantucket as well. It's a beautiful tree with this very interesting leaf, which is called cruciform, which you can see where it's kind of narrows at a waist right here. Very drought tolerant, not much fall color. Here's the leaf, kind of the underside and the top of the leaf, post oak. Here on Martha's Vineyard, it's curious. They've looked at these. This is Glenn Motzkin, who did a study of our state forest here, which I'll talk about in another aspect of it, where they have these ancient oak stools, very much like you find in Europe and other parts of the country here, where people have harvested the wood for use, mainly fuel, and they've sprouted and created these underground kind of clonal masses that create these multi-stem stool mounds. And so these trees are estimated to be 400 to 500 years plus in age. Now, the majority of the tree is underground to begin with, so the root systems are very important. This is something that we realize all over, that when you do this to certain species of oaks, it actually prolongs their longevity by, in an effect, rejuvenating them. So that's what we have here on the right with white oak on the left. This is post oak. There are a group of oaks I mentioned that do have tips. They're not bristly, and there's 3 of them that we'll talk about. Quercus montana, which you see here, used to be called for a long time Quercus prinus, and just when you got used to that name, somebody changed it. And Molenbergii, which it can be spelled different ways, but that's the chinkapin oak and Prinoides. Prinoides is here on Martha's Vineyard. I'll talk about that. Here is the yellow chestnut oak, Quercus Molenbergii. This is the one I mentioned earlier. It's endangered in Massachusetts. It's one of my favorite oaks. It doesn't always have, but sometimes it has a felty underside. It really loves limestone. Where I'm from in Michigan, where there's still oaks left along old farmlands and old roads, there's huge trees of chinkapin oak. Warren Woods is a spectacular place to see trees nearly 90 feet tall of yellow chestnut oak or chinkapin. So it's got good fall color often, orangey red. You can see here it's in Massachusetts over in the western states. Here is the dwarf version of that. It has a different acorn. I mentioned the scales are oppressed on the white oak group. This is another one. This is one of the few, there's 2 here that are rhizotomous in terms of they spread from underground stems. They inhabit dry areas here, extreme acid. They're an important source for turkeys and deer and squirrels. This is one of the few oaks that you could put in your garden for wildlife. And if you grew it from seed, within 5 years to 7 years, at least here, it produces acorns. So that's kind of a nice thing. It gets about 10 feet maybe, and that's a big plant, at least here on Martha's Vineyard. Probably grows larger in other places. This is an oak that used to be called Quercus prinus, chestnut oak, and you know, it looks a lot like chinkapin oak, but the telltale sign is the platy bark, which is really, really noticeable. And these trees can get fairly big. I have seen them throughout New England. It has a beautiful acorn that's kind of yellowish cast. The underside of the leaves can have this kind of blue-gray glaucous look. I really like this plant. We cultivate it at Polly Hill Arboretum as well. While we're talking about white oaks, and let's move away from identification from now, let's look at oaks in general. And this is from a book which I'll explain in a moment. there used to be, and it's like not used to be, but it's well documented that there is a Bolano culture, which means that there was this was termed by an archaeologist. Bolanos is Greek for acorns, and they have studied many different ancient groups. And before we had what are called granocultures, which we're in now, rice, wheat, and things like that, that we depend on, cereal grains, there were people that subsisted largely in the Middle East, China, Mexico, and California, and even here in New England on acorns as a food source. So this is something that's been studied and pretty well documented, that California, Eastern United States, and American Native Indians utilize acorns as a food source for at least the last 8,000 years. When I was in California, and this is the book again, California Oaks, I found or came to and toured with naturalists some of these sites where you find signs of this ancient culture using acorns as a food source, with these little holes which they use to grind acorns into a mash. And here's an example from a Museum of Anthropology at Berkeley, the Native American taking this meal from the acorn body, crushing it down and making this mash. They had specialized, I want to call it equipment, but things that help them do this, baskets that help them collect the acorns. An important part of it were these granaries where they would stack the acorns and let rain run through them to wash out the tannins. So it's pretty cool that this is documented, and certainly, I don't know if you've tried acorns. I bet you have, some of you. We've offered a class. One of the people we work with is a brilliant botanist, Arthur Haynes, who's worked on the Flora of New England for many years, and he came and taught a class on preparing acorns to eat. And so we had people sign up for it. It was a day long. It was really interesting. There's also in New England, and this is a group that I came into contact with a few years ago, that have a big harvest fest, and they're willing to come in New England to a town near you and show you how they do this. But the New England Acorn Cooperative is a group that is really dedicated to spreading the word about acorns, acorn nutrition. They also, I've had some muffins and bread that they've made, and I really have found it to be a terrific group to learn more about acorns and eating acorns. Let's switch to the Black Oak group. They have similarities that are kind of hard at times to tell apart, but I will mention again, the acorn, the cupule cap, has these loose scales instead of oppressed scales. The Black Oak here on Martha's Vineyard is something that is a co-dominant tree with White Oak. I have this map of Michigan here to remind you that I've actually studied oaks in Michigan quite a bit, and Black Oak and Red Oak do hybridize on these islands in northern Michigan. It's a rare thing to see, but Black Oak, in terms of identifying it, very blocky bark that you see here. It's darker. The leaf can be confused with Red Oak Quercus rubra, but if you look at the twigs, they're tomentose or hairy. I mentioned the 18 months or 2 years they need for acorn maturation. The acorn's kind of small. Here it is, but in the interior, which I mentioned before, the acorn has a kind of hairy inner cupule compared to a smooth or glabrous one of the White Oak group. On Martha's Vineyard, they get fairly tall, or not fairly tall, but fairly wide. This is a tree that's about 180 years old at the Polly Hill Arboretum. And you can see it's at flower time. Look at these catkins of another oak nearby. This is one of the oaks that Polly Hill saved. She didn't clear the native oaks out. She preserved them. And this particular tree hadn't really been worked on that much. So because of our winds and because of the damages that can happen here on Martha's Vineyard, this tree had problems with breakage. And in fact, one day we went out after a storm and you could see daylight through this crack. And so some of these secondary limbs are the size of individual trees. So we had to do something about it, and we had an oak preservation fund established. But what was so gratifying about it, when I sent this preservation letter to local arborists, they said, you know what, I won't give you money, but I'll give you my time. So Bartlett tree, Davy tree, and some groups even as far away as New Hampshire and Vermont came down, and they actually went to work on this. Sorry, I jumped ahead. What we did is we aerated the soil. It was very compacted. There's a walkway underneath the tree. We also had seen where a fireplace next door to this had covered up the roots of the tree. So we know that you want to see that flaring buttress of the crown. In this kind of new soil were organic fertilizers to kind of get the tree boosted. And then we reduced the crown by taking the weight off. We had 5 or 6 guys up in the trees reducing a lot of the branches that were adding weight. And then we put 3 metal rods through this tree. Imagine that. We did all this work, but you know, it was worth it because that was in 2012. Look at it today. It's healed completely. It is one of our iconic trees. It's a gathering place for many of our events. So we're happy to preserve a 180-year-old black oak. Red Oak Quercus rubra is not on Martha's Vineyard, but it is throughout New England. It's a tall forest tree. The bark is distinct compared to black oak. When you look up the upper extremities of the tree, they're kind of gray. There's also these kind of inroad patches, which I call ski slopes, which you look at and you can see and look at and say, oh, that's a red oak. The acorn is distinct. The cupule's kind of narrow at the top. The oak leaf looks like this, but it turns oftentimes red, has good fall color. The terminal buds don't have the hairiness of black oak. Here is a large red oak at the Morton Arboretum. Here's some good fall color. Scarlet oak is one that gets confused with black oak. It has the tomatose buds here, though. It's a tree that does not get as tall as black oak. It will cross with black oak, but the telltale sign is the bottom or the styler end, I should call it the top, the styler end with these concentric rings that you find going around here. So that's one way to tell it from black oak. Not as tall as I mentioned. Also, I should have showed you a good fall color picture. But the leaf tends to be more indented, the sinuses over here, and it has scarlet red fall color. So I always tell people, if you really want to find a scarlet oak, it's scarlet in the fall. Quercus palustris is here in New England, and for the longest time, pin oak was overplanted on Martha's Vineyard, or not on Martha's Vineyard, all throughout New England and other parts of the country. Landscape architects like it because the lower branches, the lower third are hanging down, the upper third are upright. This is the telltale form. It's a beautiful form of a tree. Here are those tiny mini-me acorns that are in their first year of development. Good fall color at times, grows in swamps. So oftentimes it's used to graft trees onto because of its urban tough root system. This is a tree on Martha's Vineyard, scrub oak. This is the Rodney Dangerfield of oaks. It doesn't get any respect. What's your name? My name is scrub oak. Okay. Well, it turns out it's a very ecologically important oak on Martha's Vineyard, and throughout its range, it colonizes by underground stems. It only reaches about 10 feet here. It's called holly oak at times. Incredibly tough. Martha's Vineyard, they're in these seaward draws that come up through the ocean, these air masses, and create what we call frost bottoms. The oak acorn of scrub oak was once used as one of the sole food sources for an extinct bird called the heath hen, which was last seen on Martha's Vineyard in 1932. And in fact, 1907 or so, they created one of the first land preserves in the United States to preserve about 28 to 30 remaining heath hens. They eventually went extinct from reproductive isolation, fires, and disease. Here on the vineyard, you will find this kind of ode to the heath hen. I did want to mention this though, because of the connection of the fauna with the flora. There is a project called the Lost Bird Project, which I think you can get on Amazon Prime or rent. And it's the history of extinct birds in North America. There's about a dozen or more. And the sculptor from Cornell University put these ceramic sculptures at the place that they were last sighted. It's a really moving film, and Todd McGrain is the guy who did the sculptures, and he came here to dedicate the heath hen sculpture at the state forest. And it's a reminder of, you know, how things can go extinct if we either eliminate their habitat or, you know, pinch them into a fragmented world. So, but on the topic of oak flora supports fauna, this is a book that I love. You can get it from your library. Unless you live in California, you should own it. But there are as many as 5,000 insect species associated with California oaks. So this is just kind of a part of the story. In the book, you'll see so many associations of various insects and invertebrates with oaks. We found some of the blue jays that hide their acorns in old stumps of oaks. It's really fascinating to see this long-term relationship between the flora and fauna of oaks and everything codependent on them. Many of you know this book by Doug Tallamy, talks about native oaks are essential for different species. They provide forage for over 517 species of native moths and butterflies, whose caterpillars are essential for native birds. So it's really that food web that oaks, when you plant an oak, you're planting an ecosystem. And this is from the Wild Ones website that goes on and talks about oaks as a tree of life and all these other trees that host various caterpillars. So oaks are incredibly important for the support of fauna. There's a book coming out soon, which I'm sure you may have heard about, but within a month, Doug Tallamy will have this book exclusively on the nature of oaks. And so that is something to look forward to. This is a book I recommend, Tracks and Signs of Insects. If you're really interested in looking at an oak and trying to document all the things codependent on it, this is a good one for people in North America. And Charlie Eisman has been here teaching courses, and it's been great to have him as a field guide. This is oak skeletonizer in my yard. It's native, and it's sitting here, and it eats all the leaves. Generally with acorns, or I should say oaks and caterpillars that are native, if they're eating things from July on, there's no reason to control them because the trees have already photosynthenated enough and stored their energy to produce their leaves for the following year. So when people get really concerned and ask me, oh, I have oak skeletonizer, I'm like, hey, don't worry about it. That tree's going to be fine. We don't need to spray chemicals on everything. This book I really love, and it's called Oak, the Frame of Civilization. And I like this saying. At first, I imagined that people brought the oaks with them, but this is not the case. The oaks evolved millions of years before the first humans arrived. Rather, it seems that people went and stayed where oaks were. We invented a whole way of living out of their fruit, their wood, and by that token, they too invented us. A great book to buy. In fact, this author has incredible books that I encourage you to pursue. Also from that, civilization prospered where oaks grew. For centuries, these supremely adaptable trees have supported humankind in nearly every facet of life. The ink which Bach wrote his first cantatas, the tall ships of the American Navy, the bread, which I mentioned earlier, fed millions in the ancient world, the first bridge and the first boats to reach the new world in 800 years, the house and the door, the wagon and the wheel, an incredible book with lots of history. Galls, these are unique. They're produced by wasps. They come in many different sizes. When I was in Mexico and Oaxaca and I was at the market looking at all the different plants for fruits and things, they had oak galls there that they actually the size of grapefruit, some even bigger, that they still use for ink in Mexico. Oak galls are formed by wasps, and what they do is they lay their eggs inside it. The wasp punctures into it and releases its eggs, and then over the leaf itself, it injects hormones that grow over, leaf tissue grows over the eggs. They hatch into this larvae, and then they emerge as adults later on. It's quite a fascinating thing, and oaks have many, many different types of galls. Here's oak galls in ink making. This is the exit hole. And here's some ancient ink from oak galls, which is very dark indigo to black in color. Let's turn the subject though to oaks in a changing world. Climate change has had an impact on oaks. Oaks are somewhat of a canary in the coal mine. They tell you when they have problems, and they do have problems, and that's something for us to be concerned about. 31% of the world's oak species are threatened with extinction, and climate change is one of the aspects of it. Also habitat destruction and fragmentation. Some of those oaks are in the United States, which we're working on. US oaks, here it is, critically endangered, 3%. There's some oaks that I've looked at, one group in the Ozarks where there's probably less than 1,000 trees. Endangered oaks at 10%. So there are problems with oaks, but a lot of people are working on them. This happened to us at Polly Hill in our natural areas. We have 72 acres, 40 acres of oak woodland, and about 25 acres of it died after repeated infestation of caterpillars, which I'll talk about, native caterpillars, 250 acres in an adjacent area next to us. Here's the ridge line of our property where we have steep drainage. And what happened is the fall cankerworm came from 2008 to about 2012, right after our oaks leafed out, and they started to eat the foliage right after they leafed out. And after 4 years of successive eating by primarily fall cankerworm, the trees leafed out in a drought one summer and they collapsed. And so this is believed to be related to climate change, where the parasitoids and every other things, fungus and things, did not keep these in check. So when we look at pests and diseases and they're being exacerbated, it's because kind of like the biological web and clock, which used to synchronize these populations, has been altered, so they take off. You guys know about winter moth. It's from Eurasia. This has been a problem. It's from Europe, I should say. On oaks as well, and gypsy moth has long-term been a problem throughout New England. Here's our arboretum. You can see the die-off. I am happy to report this forest is responding and growing back again. Here I am in kind of this desolate scene of mostly black oaks. We had also a visit from a cynipid wasp, a specific wasp. There's a lot of cynipid wasps, but this is a stem gall producer. And it caused mortality a little bit later on in conjunction with Bothrosphaeria canker. So this is believed to be an insect that has kind of exploded because of climate-related issues. We have this on Martha's Vineyard, which isn't killing plants. It does stunt them. It's Lucanium scale. There's a species, seems to be unique to the Cape and Martha's Vineyard. We're keeping an eye on this. There's also this potential, I don't want this to be such a downer, but Michigan Oak Wilt Coalition, when I was in Michigan, oak wilt was a problem. It's been reported very small instances in Western Mass. We're hoping it doesn't come into the state, but Michigan oak wilt, you can go to this site. There's a video that talks about oak wilt, predominantly on red oaks, but also impacts white oak. Here it is in its distribution. This is an old map. You can see it's in Long Island. It's not shown in Western Mass, but there's rumors that it may be there. Significant problem. Let me talk about oaks just to finish up here. In terms of production, they have a fleshy taproot, so there's a lot of people who graft red oak group onto Quercus palustris, the white oak group onto bicolor, and use acorn production, different stage containers, storage containers to produce them. Oak cloning is something that's happening. This is what we're doing at Polly Hill and others. They start to treat the taproot early by using these production containers that aerate the roots and cause them to sprout out, so they die back essentially and form more fibrous root systems. So they're made by the root maker pot company. You can use these for things like Tupelo or Nyssa sylvatica and other things to produce more fibrous roots. Here are the bottom of the trays. Aeration is the key. Here they are in production in larger containers for bigger oaks. This is Bur Oak in the Midwest. Here they are kind of placed in there. There's a fabric put on the bottom. The trees are filled with the containers, and eventually they aerate out and create these fibrous root masses, which they transplant into the landscape with higher success. There's also work, I should say, with acorns. How do you preserve an oak tree when you can't store an acorn? They're called exceptional species for two reasons. They're cool and amazing, but the other thing, they're exceptional in that you can't store their seed in a traditional seed bank. So when we have endangered oaks, there's a lot of work being done by the Oak Society to fund things like stem preservation and cryopreservation. I'm nearing the end and I'm about to go over time, so I'm going to speed this up. But essentially, they can take stems through tissue culture or through apical embryos, axes here, and put them into an auger and preserve them for 20, 30, 40 years. So it's something that we're really excited about. And this is shoot tip work that's being done. This is at the Cincinnati Zoo. This is Valerie Pence and her work, where they can take these out of the cryobank, grow them on augers, and voila, they have a plant. So this is something that's hopeful for the future. And also there's cloning work done with micropropagation, just tissue culture in general, from Nina Bassick at Cornell. So there's some really cool oaks work going on. They need juvenile shoots to root. They're difficult to root from cuttings. They're primarily grafted in the nursery industry in terms of cultivars. So we're finishing up here. Where to see oaks in New England? You can go to Mount Auburn and the Arnold Arboretum. In your local natural areas, there's a Plant Collections Consortium, PCN network, part of the APGA, who's sponsoring this, collaborating in the sponsorship of this webinar. And you can find near you where there may be significant oak collections for you to go look at. Certainly go to your natural areas to look at them first. Finally, I want to tell you we're just about done, so if you have questions and answers, go ahead and send them to Penny. I've gone over, so I'm going to hurry through this. The IOS, the International Oak Society, I'm on their board and happy to report we have an Oak Conservation and Research Fund, which people have given to in a matching situation that has just approved 3 different grant applications for oaks, so it's very exciting. You can look at their website. You may want to become a member, yet another plant group to join. But certainly go to their website. It's incredible, the resources. If you're a member, it opens you up to all these research papers and oak articles, and we'd love to see you at a membership meeting. As far as street trees go, you guys know these books, many of you. This one came out though, and it talks about new oaks. With all these different ways to clone oaks coming into fruition now, there's many oaks being used as street trees. So I encourage you to look at this book. It's newly produced by Michael Durr. Keith Warren used to be the production manager at Schmidt's Nursery for many, many years, where they grow many oaks for distribution. Finally, I'm going to end by just saying, you know, there's a lot about oaks which I shared with you today, but certainly during these times where it seems like so much uncertainty is happening and we feel like, wow, when is the world going to come back to some sense of normalcy? Well, 2 things. Nature will connect you. Obviously, spending more time in nature will help your psyche, but to help both your psyche and the planet, consider planting oaks, because you're really putting your your best into a hopeful future when you plant an oak. We talked about all the things that are associated with oak. So you can plant a tree and maybe you won't see it. You know, the saying is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The best next time is now. But consider oaks and consider the future. And I want to thank you all for listening to my oak talk. And I want to thank all the sponsors and Penny today for sponsoring this and allowing me to share this information. I'm going to also leave this with you, and Penny will tell you more about this and where you'll be able to get it later on. So thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim. We have several questions. The first is, how might we get to see the research that you did in Mexico?
Oh, what you would do is you would go to the University of Mexico, UNAM, and you would just Google the Flora of Oaxaca, and it's spelled Oaxaca. And the Flora of Oaxaca will go into the diversity found within the state. My specimens are at the Missouri Botanic Garden, UNAM, which is in Mexico, and also I believe at Michigan State University. So those specimens, and I actually have my own copy, my own specimens. The leaves of these trees are like leather. They're incredible. They're very hairy. They're drought deciduous. One of the things that was very difficult for me and humbling was to be there, and I was working full time at the time, and you know, I was in really desperate, poor parts of the country, and so a lot of the trees were being cut down. And you know, we have, of course, so much privilege. When I was there, I realized that we're living like kings compared to people in different parts of the world. And so, you know, the work in Mexico continues. There's a tremendous amount of research with oaks going on by Alan Coombs. If you go to the International Oak Society's website, you can read about his work preserving oaks in Mexico. Very, very inspirational.
Very good. Other than the timing of insects, as you mentioned, is there any visible signs of climate change affecting oaks in New England that we should be looking for?
Yeah, a couple things. What you want to look out for is just continuous attack by certain insect pests that may even be native. And, you know, we decided not to spray our woodlands. I should say our staff and board, did a demarcation where we said that is a natural area undergoing unnatural phenomena. So it's a hard choice to make. What we told people, if you have continuous attacks of native insect species, it's really because more or less what we call a trophic cascade effect. Whatever used to keep them in check, and here on Martha's Vineyard, they identified a parasitoid that came in, and also a fungus that eventually caught up with the fall cankerworm and wiped it out. Just be aware of that, and be also aware of that we may have these explosions for your own oak forest in and around. What I did is just monitored the trees in and around my garden, and I watered them. So that's the other thing. In times of drought, you may want to give them some additional help. Look out for scale insects, and also don't be afraid to contact somebody like Bartlett Tree. We like Bartlett Tree because they have a research division. So they kind of have been following the problems with oak and climate change over the last few years. I would also, in general, for everybody in the ELA, be cognizant of the fact that sudden oak death, which is an imported fungus called Phytophthora, that was imported into California from nurseries. It was imported on the root systems of rhododendrons and some other plants. The USDA and APHIS, and they have a nursery inspections here in New England that have stopped two outbreaks here from spreading in New England. So if you see anything that looks like a wilting tree where the leaves are flagging, you may want to hire a professional. It's more than likely, if it's on a red oak, it's going to be oak wilt. But if not, you know, we need to have a constant vigilance out for sudden oak death and its importation from foreign sources.
That's very important. Good to know. Can you remind us how old oak as a species is?
Well, in the fossil record, it goes anywhere between, I think it's about 60 million years old in the fossil record. I read recently 45 million years old. If you go to the American Oak site that's hosted by Andrew Hipp from the Morton Arboretum, it'll be in your handout here. In fact, it's called Oaks of the Americas. And if you type that into Google, it'll list the fossil history of oaks. What's kind of curious about it, oaks actually originated from a more primitive group that was down in South America, believe it or not, called Trigonobalanus. That actually goes back over 100 million years. But they all have, which is really curious, that acorn, even going back that far. So it's really interesting.
Very interesting. We have a comment that many people are allergic to oak pollen, and we have a few recommendations for web searches that you can do if you want to learn more about that.
That's great.
Next question. Do oaks grow with pines because they have a mutual root system?
That's actually a really good question. They have similar root systems in terms of they tend to have a taproot that goes down first. Oaks are pretty smart. They're like, well, the first thing I'm going to do is anchor myself and get to water. And then the secondary roots, just like most trees, they're in the top 12 to 15 inches of the soil. So they are vulnerable working around oak root systems. I tend to think it's because of their reproductive similarities. They're both wind pollinated, they localize and drop their seed. But the biggest, clearest factor would always be what ecologists call edaphic conditions, which are the soil conditions. So I think it's a combination of the soils that they both like to occupy in unison. And then they're also their reproductive capacity and the way they put down their root systems. It's very striking where you see them always, not always, but oftentimes mixed together.
Very good. Can you tell the general age of oaks by diameter at breast height or some other quick way?
No, I wish I could. It's really interesting here, like that oak that I showed you. That's down by the coast, the one that's squat and horizontal. That might be 150 years old. So the diameter of that, we wouldn't be able to tell. Also, in and around my house here, the white oaks and post oaks are all multi-stem because they've been cut repeatedly for firewood. With the Europeans coming here on Martha's Vineyard and also extending into the United States, you know, these second generation, third generation forests on Martha's Vineyard, you can't tell. The easiest way, which is difficult with oaks, is to do, you know, you bore in them with an incremental bore. And we have done that here on Martha's Vineyard. Because our trees don't grow as tall, we found things like the tupelo tree, which aren't that tall and really don't have that thick of a diameter, but the density of wood is such was when we've done cores on some of them, we would say, just kind of looking at those trees, and some oaks, oh, they're maybe 100 years old. And it turns out some of them are near 300 years old or older. So the coring is really the only way to tell. And it's difficult to pull those things out of the wood once you do the cores.
Yes, oak is famously tough. Can you recommend an oak expert in the southeastern United States?
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I would recommend Greg Page. And Greg Page is the Director of Horticulture at the Bartlett Research Facility, which is in Charlotte, North Carolina. And you can actually go to that facility and see oaks being evaluated in their collection. Some of them new, and then some of them just species oaks. But Greg Page is super knowledgeable. His last name is Paige. He would be just one that I really admire. The other one who's super hard to get a hold of is Ron Lance, R-O-N, Ron Lance, and he is also extremely knowledgeable. I may be able to get the emails to you if Penny facilitates that.
Yes, I can do that. Do you share acorns or seedlings with other arboreta?
We can. The oaks that we grow under permit are kind of are something that we don't have a lot of. But if you are an arboretum and you want to send your information to me here at info@Polly Hill Arboretum, I could connect you with kind of the oak resource group that if we don't have it, somebody else would. And in fact, we would welcome that interchange because we would like to, with certain species, get them in the hands of other people. You know, it's funny, a lot of people say, what's the value of ex situ conservation, which is meaning growing plants outside of their own natural areas? Well, natural areas are under siege in many places, so growing plants off-site sometimes saves trees from extinction. I think many of you know the Ben Franklin tree, Franklinia, now extinct in the wild. So the Quercus multi-site group, which I mentioned earlier before with the APGA, which actually is called the Plant Collection Network, your arboretum, we'd be happy to connect you with that group, and it would open up an oak valve that might flood you, but we'd be happy to do that for you.
Okay, very good. Are there certain acorns that you should eat, certain oak type acorns?
Yeah, the ones that I prefer are chinkapin oak and Quercus prenoides, so the Muhlenbergii prenoides, and then just straight white oak. And white oak is easier to find, obviously. Arthur Haynes, though, did change my mind on the black oak group. I think he brought black oaks and red oaks for his oak work. So I think the only thing, if you go to the New England Acorn Cooperative, which I have on the sheet for you and on the show here, they can tell you how to handle both groups. The red oak group, though, has to be soaked and the tannins removed a little bit more so because they just have a heavier content of tannins.
Okay, thank you. Do you know if the English oak provides the same ecological benefits as our native white oaks?
You know, that's a really good question, and it's a curious one, and I think it's worth studying because we tend to think, because we think in short intervals of time, like our lifetimes, we tend to think that maybe, you know, they wouldn't be adopted or adapted, you know, by our, I should say adopted by our local insects and fungus and things. I would say more likely some of them will be. And that is just through time that would happen. So for instance, here on Martha's Vineyard, we have about 160 lichens, which probably more than that, which is a big part of our kind of organismal flora here. And they are the same lichens that grow on white oak. The bark is very similar on English oak. So yeah, no, I think it's worth looking into. I do know the group that we discovered, there's been 2 groups of Quercus robur on the island. You know, we're very involved with telling people and facilitating the removal of invasive plants, which we all should be. So I've gone over to those groups, and my goodness, the acorns are gone. They are tasty and taken away by the animals. So I think it's worth looking at and maybe even studying and seeing if there is kind of that happening. And I would say, and when I was saying about the time, you know, there was at one point in time a generalized, large, huge, similar flora that stretched all the way over to Europe and Asia, and then everything broke apart with the continents. But all these plants have a kind of long-term relationship to each other. So it wouldn't surprise me that some of these would be adopted by our local fauna.
Okay, good. Do you have any general recommendations for those of us who are fortunate to have very old oaks, what we should do to protect and preserve them?
Yeah, the key things are not to do damage to the root systems. If you are in New England, one of the things about oak wilt, which I remember from my days in Michigan, you should avoid pruning them from April to July 15th. That is something, the wounds of oaks during those time periods, sometimes they ferment more or less and release gases which attract what they call the sap beetle or the picnic beetle, which spreads oak wilt. So limit all of your pruning to right now. Right now is a good time. In fact, we prune most of our trees here at Polly Hill in the winter. It's a great time to see the crown and the architecture of a tree. The other thing is water trees in times of severe drought and minimize the impact on the root systems. Don't park your car on them. Don't allow damage from construction. Those would be the main things.
Very good. What are your best recommendations for street tree oaks on the East Coast?
Well, I really do like a series of oaks, and you can find them on the International Oak Society's website. There's a series of different oaks that are crosses, believe it or not, of Quercus bicolor and macrocarpa. And you'll see those in nurseries, and there's a few that are called Quercus X, which means a hybrid warei, and it's W-A-R-E-I. And these are upright oaks that work in narrow street tree situations. They're also, because of their heritage of either bicolor or macrocarpa, they're grafted onto root systems that are super tough. The average urban lifespan of a tree is less than 15 years. I think many of you probably have heard that. But yeah, I would stick to the white oak group cultivars, and I would look on the website to see some of these new cultivars. That book that I mentioned, and you can get it at your library because it's super expensive, Trees by Michael Durr. There's about 100 different cultivated varieties. The question is, which people always ask me, like, well, I can't find it. So what I tell people to do is have enough of your friends, go to your local nursery, preferably 1 or 2, and demand the same tree. And eventually they'll come to your demand and start supplying it. But I would go with the white oak group, the new cultivars, or you can even try to just grow Quercus bicolor. That's a superb street tree.
Very good. Anecdotally, we seem to have had several mast years in a row, at least 4 out of the last 5. Are you attributing that to climate-related conditions?
You know, I went to a talk on masting, the science of it, in California 3 years ago, and I was shocked. It's incredibly complex. And it didn't really talk that much about the impact of climate change. There are several things that I do remember from the talk. Most of it is the energy reserve of the trees that kind of regulate it. That's the number one thing. But there can be factors as simple as this, which I've seen here on Martha's Vineyard. If it's May, like May 7th through May 17th, and we have a week of rain, when the pollen is supposed to be flying around, and instead it's just washed off of everything, and the pollen isn't necessarily airborne, it's just swamped, that can limit the pollination and fruit set of an oak, the acorn. So masting, if you go to the Oak Society's website, and if you just Google it, you'll find out different explanations, but it's mostly based on the energy reserve of the trees and then also the environmental conditions during flowering. A tree, though, I will tell you, in general, most trees, and maybe this is what you're getting at, and it's certainly worth looking at, when they're under stress, they kind of think like, well, maybe I'm going to succumb soon. So stressed plants in general flower as a response to their environment, and also tough conditions, thinking that I need to reproduce because I might not make it, and they want to, send their generation forward. So, going back to tree culture, I would just make sure you water those plants. The other thing is, drought can impact acorns in terms of they abort early if it's really droughty. So you can help your own oaks in your landscape by providing deep water feeding, not kind of just feeding along the roots. We all talk about watering trees, but I do the classic way. You take a hose at a trickle, and I put a timer on my phone, and I just deep soak my oak trees. And I do it for one tree in particular that's close to the hose bin. That's a white oak that I collect seed off of, and it has helped. So I would water trees if you want more acorn production to last.
Very good. The Quercus prenoides sounded wonderful. Do you have a recommendation for where to source this tree for a homeowner?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if they have it, but there is an interesting group who I first started to work with when I was in Michigan, and it's called Oikos Tree Crops. They're also into edible plants and growing things like chestnuts as well, and hazelnuts. They might have it, and they also have a number of trees they've selected for early fruiting. So they're in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and you spell it Oikos, Oikos Trees. And they sell small trees and ship them via mail. So that's the other thing. They're all organic too. It's a great company.
Good to know. Do you recommend any particular shrubs or small trees to plant as understory under oaks?
Yeah, actually, I do. There's a few shrubs and things that do well. Actually, a tree that does fairly well with oaks is, I have a hard time thinking of the name, ironwood, or Astraea virginiana, which grows here on Martha's Vineyard. So ironwood is a good plant. Carpinus carolinianum, the hornbeam is another one. As far as shrubs, in my yard, which I have 12 resident deer come through, I grow Lindera benzoin, the spice bush. I also grow Viburnum dentatum, arrowwood, and withrod, Viburnum casinoides. Those are two natives that I grow. I also grow underneath oaks, Fothergilla. It's not native to Martha's Vineyard. Fothergilla gardenii and Fothergilla major. Those are really good understory plants. I also grow, which isn't native to Martha's Vineyard, but because of our acidity, I grow the Iteas. They're different shrubs that are smaller in size. So Itea virginica, a very good plant. Yeah, so most of what I try to do is couple those plants in by their water regime as well. And the other thing which I've been growing in my garden, transplanting bare root from different areas, is American beech tree, which can be bare rooted and transplanted in its dormancy right around the third week of February here, or before March 15th. I transplanted 7 American beech, and they've all taken. And so that's another nice wildlife plant with the beech nuts.
Very good. Can you give us a very, very quick primer on collecting and planting the acorns? And at what point would you transplant the saplings?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to do it. A lot of people want to plant acorns right into the ground, but I'm afraid the curiosity of animals usually gets them. So what I do is, and I've done this for years, is I have these pots. You can Google them. They're called monarch band pots. So monarch like the butterfly, BAND. And they're biodegradable pots. They last just over a year, which is all you need. And you can plant the pots right in the ground, but they're open on the bottom, and you buy a flat with them. And essentially, I collect the acorns before the animals can get them. I soak them in water and a 10% solution of bleach. I take the acorn cap or the cupule off before I do this. I soak them for about 10 minutes in a 10% water beach solution. I put them in a mix of perlite or vermiculite that's moist. And what you'll see, which is you have to watch out for, the white oak group will germinate the very first fall. So with that group, you really can't store them in your refrigerator that long. So I plant them directly in the pots at about 2 inches deep. And in the flat, I cover the flat with a mesh screen, because even those acorns planted in a pot, the mice will find them. I have also, I don't think this necessarily makes a difference, but it has in the past. In some instances, I actually soak them in Frank's hot sauce. And that sometimes keep the creatures out. You can also spray, which you guys probably know, Bobex or deer, anything that has a smelliness to it. I plant the white oak groups directly in the pots in the fall, bury them like I mentioned, water them in. You can even put a little bit of chicken grit as a cap on top of those. The chicken grit you can buy locally from your farm store. And then I just keep the screen on, and they'll put the radical root down that very first year, very deep, 3 to 4 to 5 inches. And then they need that cold period, which we call winter here, and the shoot will come out and sprout. Now with the other group, the red oak group, you can keep those in that vermiculite or moist perlite mix in your refrigerator throughout the winter, just at common 40 degrees. They will not sprout. Pull them out in about March or April, and then do the same thing with the pots. And they'll sprout the radical and the shoot at the same time, and you'll have your oaks. And once you get them through that first year, you can plant them directly in the ground. And if you don't have too many problems with animals, if you do, you can just put a screen around them or one of those grow tubes. A lot of people plant with those white plastic grow tubes to protect them from animal damage. But it's been a fairly successful way to grow them.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that very useful information. And one of our listeners has written that she loves the fact that when you plant an oak, you plant an ecosystem. So thank you so much, Tim. I appreciate you taking all of this time, Tim. It's been just a real inspiration for us all.
Well, you're welcome, and everybody stay safe and healthy, and good luck in this upcoming year. Take care, everybody. Thanks again.